The first truck comes through around 4:40 in the morning, before there's even a hint of gray in the sky, just headlights swinging wide off, the county road and a diesel engine dropping down through its gears. Wendell hears it from the bedroom, half asleep, and figures it's somebody lost, or somebody hauling gravel for the Hutchins place down the road. He doesn't get up. By the time the second truck comes through 20 minutes later, he's up anyway, standing at the kitchen window in his undershirt with a mug of instant coffee, watching a set of taillights swing around, at the end of his fence line, and back up toward the field. The hydraulic bed groans as it lifts. Something heavy shifts and slides and thumps down onto the grass in the dark. Over and over, a sound like a landslide made of basketballs. He doesn't go out. Not yet. There's a kind of farm logic that says if something's happening on your land in the black of night, you wait for daylight to deal with it, because whatever it is will still be there in an hour and you'll be able to see what you're dealing with. Nobody knocks on his door first. Nobody leaves a note. By the time the sun starts to come up over the ridge, there have been 6 trucks, maybe 7, and he's lost count of exactly when one leaves and the next one shows up, because for a stretch they're nearly bumper to bumper, engines idling in a line down the shoulder of the road like they're waiting to get into a fair. He finally walks out around 6:15, coffee gone cold in his hand, and what he finds at the edge of his own hayfield stops him, about 30 feet short of the fence. Pumpkins, not a truckload, not 2, a hillside of them, stretching back into ground fog that hasn't burned off yet, orange skins catching the first low light coming over the trees. Somewhere off past the pile, a crow is already working the edges, and somewhere closer than that, a driver he doesn't recognize is climbing back up into his cab without so much as a wave, without an explanation, without so much as slowing down enough to make eye contact. By 9, the pile has swallowed the fence row he spent 2 summers ago, rebuilding board by board. By noon, from the porch, it doesn't look like a field anymore. It looks like the ground itself has turned orange, stems poking up out of the mess like something's been planted upside down. The smell of crushed vine and wet dirt hanging over the whole property, thick enough to taste. His neighbor Dale slows his truck on the road around lunchtime, leans out the window, takes one look, and can't help himself. "Well," Dale says, grinning like it's the funniest thing he's seen all month, "guess you're cleaning that up till Christmas." Wendell doesn't answer him. He's not being rude. He's just already somewhere else in his head. By the time he tracks down what actually happened, a phone call to the county extension office, another to a cousin who knows a guy who drives for one of the regional co-ops. The story comes together in pieces. A processing contract fell through overnight. A packing plant to states over went belly up without warning anyone. Somewhere in a chain of phone calls between people who never once thought to call him, somebody decided the back 40 of an old farmer's property, a man with no fence, gate, lock, and a long dirt frontage, was as good a dumping ground as any. Nobody asked him. Nobody was ever going to ask him. That's just how it went. He could be angry about it. Plenty of people in his position would be. Instead, he does the thing he's done with every disaster this farm has handed him for 61 years: droughts, a barn fire in 94, a winter that killed off a third of his herd. Which is he walks the length of it, slow, hands in his coat pockets, and he starts counting, not roughly, not looks like a few thousand. He counts in rows, marking off sections with the stick dragged through the dirt, working methodically, the way he's counted hay bales and fence posts and head of cattle his whole life. Because a number you can trust is worth more to him than a number that just sounds impressive. It takes him the better part of 2 hours. 3,000 and change. He rounds down, out of habit more than accuracy, standing at the edge of it as the sun finally clears the tree line and throws long gold light across a field that was green 2 days ago. His face doesn't do what you'd expect. It doesn't fall. It doesn't tighten up in anger. It just goes still, the way a man's face goes still when he's already doing math in his head. His granddaughter shows up around 8, sent over by her mother to check on him after somebody in town called with the news, and finds him still standing there with his stick in the dirt, notebook nowhere in sight, just counting in his head. She asks him what he's going to do. He doesn't answer right away, just keeps looking at the pile like it's a puzzle somebody dumped out on a table, all the pieces face down. Don't know yet, he tells her, which isn't something she's used to hearing from him. Her grandfather has an answer for almost everything. Weather, machinery, when to plant, when to sell. Not knowing out loud is new. "Are you mad?" she asks. He thinks about that one longer than the first question. "Not much use being mad at pumpkins," he says finally, and that's as close to a joke as he's going to manage all day. Everyone driving past that morning saw 3,000 pumpkins dumped on an old man's field. He saw 3,000 decisions he hadn't made yet. If you want to understand why Wendell McIntyre didn't panic that morning, you have to have seen the inside of his barn. There's a coffee can on the workbench, the old red Folgers kind, so dented and rust-spotted you can barely read the label anymore. And it's full with coffee. Hasn't held coffee in 30 years. With nails. Bent ones. Pulled out of scrap lumber. Straighten one at a time on the corner of the anvil, dropped in the can to wait for the next job that needs a nail and doesn't much care if it's perfectly straight. His late wife used to tease him about it, told him the hardware store in town was still open, still selling nails by the pound, and he'd tell her the same thing every time. Those are perfectly good nails. The fence along the east pasture isn't one fence. It's 4 decades of fence, patched board over board, and if you know what you're looking at, you can read the history of the place in it the way you'd read tree rings. A rough stretch of gray wood from a bad ice storm somewhere in the late 80s. A run of newer boards from the year his son helped him rebuild after a windstorm. Took down 30 feet of it. One section still held together, with baling wire because the job of replacing it properly just never made it to the top of the list. His tools are older than some of the people who show up to buy pumpkins off his truck. The shovel he uses to muck the barn belonged to his father. The handle's been replaced twice. The head hasn't been replaced at all, and probably won't be as long as he's the one swinging it. None of this is about being cheap. Not really. Though people in town like to say it that way, like it's some kind of quirk. It's closer to a rule he doesn't think about anymore, because it's just how his hands work. Nothing leaves this place until it's been asked what else it's good for. Feed scraps that aren't fit for the counter go to the hogs. Whatever the hogs won't touch goes into a compost pile out past the equipment shed that's been cooked on and off since before his kids were born. Turned with a fork twice a season, steaming faintly on cold mornings. The whole thing slowly becoming next year's dirt. He saves seed corn some years instead of buying fresh. Not because he can't afford the fresh seed, but because his father saved seed. And there's a stubbornness in him about breaking habits that have worked fine for 60 years. His father used to say it, standing at the edge of a field that looked a lot like this one does now, minus the pumpkins, just before harvest most years. Like it was a kind of blessing he handed down instead of a lesson. The farm'll feed you twice, the old man would say, if you're not too proud to use everything on it. Wendell didn't think much of the phrase as a boy. It sounded like the kind of thing fathers say that doesn't mean anything specific. The way money doesn't grow on trees doesn't really teach a kid anything about economics. It took him into his 30s, maybe his 40s, to understand what his father actually meant. That the growing is only half the job. The other half is refusing to let any of it go to waste once it's out of the ground. That's the lesson sitting in the back of his head at 6:30 that morning, standing at the edge of 3,000 pumpkins that arrived on his land, without so much as a phone call. Everybody else who hears about it over the next few days is going to tell him the same thing. Call somebody, get it hauled off, dig a pit and bury the mess before it turns into a health hazard. He's already not listening, not because he's stubborn, though he is that too. It's because standing there in the cold, looking at a hillside of orange that would ruin most men's week, Wendell isn't seeing a disaster. He's doing inventory, knowing what something's worth and having the time to get that value out of it are two very different problems. And by the second day, Wendell is finding out just how little time he actually has. A pumpkin isn't hay. It doesn't sit patiently in a barn for a season waiting on you. The moment it's off the vine, it's already on a clock. And 3,000 of them stacked out in the open, exposed to weather, are 3,000 separate clocks all ticking down at slightly different speeds depending on how deep in the pile they landed and how much weight is sitting on top of them. The ones on the bottom go first. He finds that out the hard way on the second morning, walking the base of the pile and pressing his thumb into a soft brown patch on a pumpkin that looked fine from 3 feet away. The skin gives like a bruised peach, and underneath, it's already collapsing into something the color of wet cardboard. The second night it rains, and not the gentle kind. A front comes through, sometime after midnight, and by morning, the whole field is a mess. Water standing in the low spots, mud working its way up into the base of the pile, turning the stretch of the driest ground he owns into something closer to a hog wallow. The deer are already coming through the tree line most evenings, bolder than usual. And it isn't just deer. He finds raccoon tracks all through the softer pumpkins near the edges of the pile. Half-eaten holes gnawed into rinds like something out of a horror picture. And the crows have figured out the whole arrangement faster than any of the other wildlife they've been working the tops of the pile since day one, like they knew before he did that this was coming. And underneath all of it, quiet, patient. Doing more damage than the deer and the raccoons and the rain combined is the mold. He cuts one open on the third day just to check. A pumpkin that looks perfectly fine on the outside. Decent color, firm stem, and the inside is already gray and collapsed. Gone soft in a way that tells him this one's been lost for 2 days at least, and he just didn't know it. Every hour he doesn't act as pumpkins, he's going to lose. Not all of them, but enough that it matters. Enough that the difference between moving fast and moving slow is going to show up, eventually, as real money, real spoilage, real waste sitting out, rotting into ground that used to be his hayfield. People keep telling him the same thing, like they've all read from the same script. Dale says it again on day 3. His cousin says it on the phone. Get an excavator out here. Dig a trench. Bury the whole business before the smell gets bad enough that the county calls it a nuisance complaint. Wendell listens to every bit of it. The way he listens to most advice, he doesn't plan on taking. Nodding along, saying in the right places, and then goes back to doing exactly what he was already doing before anybody opened their mouth. That third night, he sits at the kitchen table. Same table his wife used to roll out pie dough on. Same table his kids did their homework at. With a legal pad and a pencil. That's down to about 3 inches of usable length. And he starts writing. He doesn't write one plan. He's lived long enough to know better than to bet a whole season on one idea. If the pie idea falls through, or the market's flooded, or nobody wants to buy whole pumpkins off a stranger's driveway, he needs 6 other things already moving. So the whole effort doesn't collapse because of one bad guess. So he writes 20 ideas, crosses out 4 of them almost immediately. Too much money up front. Too much equipment he doesn't have. Add 6 more as the night goes on. Circles, the ones he can start tomorrow morning with nothing but a truck and a folding table. Underlines the ones that are going to need other people, because he already knows he can't do this alone. Not at this scale, not on this clock. By the time the coffee's gone cold, and his is the only porch light, still on for half a mile in either direction, that legal pad is covered corner to corner in his cramped, slanted handwriting. Half of it barely legible even to him. The clock hasn't stopped. Pumpkins are still rotting out there in the dark, whether he's ready or not. Around midnight, he calls his son, who moved off to work in insurance, 40 minutes north, and hasn't done a full day of farm work in almost a decade, mostly just to talk it through out loud. His son listens a while, then says the things sons say when they've been gone long enough to forget how their fathers actually operate. Dad, you could just call somebody, pay to have it hauled off. Could, Wendell says. Costs money to bury something that's still worth something. There's a pause on the line long enough that Wendell wonders if the call dropped. Then his son laughs, not unkindly. The way you laugh at somebody you've watched do this exact thing your whole life. You're gonna be up all night with that legal pad, aren't you? Already am. They talk a few more minutes about nothing much. The grandkids. A fence post that needs replacing. Whether the Hendersons ever fix that culvert before hanging up. It doesn't change anything about the plan sitting on the table. But it's the kind of call Wendell's father used to make to his own brother on nights like this one. And there's something steadying about doing the same thing 40 years later, even with the phone instead of a party line. But for the first time since the trucks pulled away that first morning, he isn't just standing at the edge of the field watching it happen to him. By 6 the next morning, the legal pad stops being a legal pad and starts turning into actual trucks in the driveway, actual phone calls to people he hasn't spoken to in months, an actual farm moving faster than it has in years. He doesn't try to build one big operation out of 3,000 pumpkins. That's not how he thinks. He builds 30 small ones instead, each one only needing to chew through a slice of the pile to be worth doing. Each one cheap enough to start with what's already sitting in his barn. The firmest ones, the ones without a mark on them, go out first. Wipes down, stacked on an old hay wagon at the end of the driveway. A hand-lettered sign leaned against, a milk crate and a coffee can for cash because he doesn't have the patience to sit out there making change all day. By the second morning, there are cars backed up along the shoulder before he's even finished setting the wagon up. His neighbor, Ruth, who's run the pie table at the church bake sale every October since Wendell can remember, shows up on her own without being asked and hauls off a truckload for pies. Somebody else's daughter, girl who works at the bakery 2 towns over, takes a batch home and comes back 2 days later with pumpkin bread. The store agrees to carry. First time they've ever stocked anything that wasn't made in their own kitchen. His sister Carol gets a pot going on her stove. That's, honestly, bigger than anything a stove ought to have on it. Soup simmering down into jars. She sells at the Saturday market, alongside bags of roasted seeds. His grandkids salt and bag at the kitchen table, which mostly means half the seeds end up eaten before they're bagged, and nobody says anything about it. The seeds that survive, the grandkids get pressed for oil, a batch small enough that a specialty shop in the city is willing to carry it on consignment. No money up front, which suits Wendell fine, because he's not looking to gamble what little cash he's got on something that might not sell. Whatever's too soft for the wagon, but not gone yet, goes straight to the hogs, who by the second week are eating better than they have in years, and whatever the hogs turn their nose up at goes into the compost pile his father started, closing a loop that's been closing on this farm for longer than Wendell's been alive. The odd-shaped ones, the lumpy and cross-eyed and slightly deformed pumpkins that nobody wants for a pie, get pulled aside for porches and doorsteps, sold by charm instead of by pound to families decorating for the season. Then the school calls. A third-grade teacher heard about the pile from her sister and asks, half joking, if her class could come see it. Wendell says, sure. Why not? And what starts as one class trip turns into something bigger almost by accident. Kids picking their own pumpkin out of the pile for a couple dollars each. Parents standing around afterward, buying cider because it's a cool morning and there's nothing else to do while they wait. That turns into a weekend thing without anybody exactly deciding it should. Carving stations set up under the barn overhang. Hay bales dragged out for seating. A bonfire once it gets dark enough. Mostly because Wendell's grandson wanted an excuse to burn some brush, and nobody stopped him. Cafes start calling. A restaurant on the other side of the county line puts in a standing order for puree, delivered every Tuesday in 5-gallon buckets. Wendell borrows back and forth from the dairy down the road. A woman from the regional food bank calls and asks, careful like she's expecting to be told no, whether he'd consider donating a load. He tells her to send a truck Thursday and doesn't charge her a nickel, and doesn't think twice about it either, though it turns out to matter more than he expects. Not everything works. He tries drying a batch of seeds for garden packets and loses half of them to mold because he didn't spread them thin enough, a mistake that costs him 2 days and a decent amount of muttering under his breath. A carving weekend gets rained out entirely, and he spends a Saturday standing under the barn overhang alone, coffee going cold, wondering if he oversold the whole idea to himself. But more of it works than doesn't. Preserves, seasonal, decorations sold off the same hay wagon, pumpkins tossed whole into the hog pen, just for the animals to root around and destroy, which the grandkids find funnier than anything else on the whole farm. A photographer from 2 counties over asks if she can use the pile as a backdrop for fall portraits and pays him $50 for the privilege, which strikes Wendell as about the strangest money he's made all year. Every solution chips a little more off the pile. Every morning, it's smaller than it was the morning before. And around town, the same question keeps circling. At the diner counter, in line at the feed store, in the church parking lot on Sunday. What's the old man going to do with the rest of them? The laughing stops somewhere around the 2nd week, though nobody marks the exact day it happened. Teenagers who spent most of the summer complaining there was nothing to do in this town start showing up on their own to haul, sort, and hose down pumpkins for real wages. Cash Wendell counts out of a coffee can at the end of each shift because he's never bothered opening a business account for something he figured would only last a season. Ruth and the bakery girl, who by rights ought to be competing for the same customers on Main Street, end up working the same kitchen most Tuesdays, trading recipes back and forth, splitting a standing order neither one of them could have filled alone. The school comes back a second time, then a third, and by the 4th week, there's a waiting list, which is a phrase Wendell never expected to use about his own hayfield. Restaurants keep the orders coming. An artist from the college 2 towns over shows up with a box of paints one Saturday and turns a dozen of the ugliest pumpkins in the pile into things she sells for more than the pumpkins were ever going to fetch on their own. And Wendell watches her work for a while, not saying much, mostly just impressed. Families that hadn't set foot on a working farm in a generation start treating the place like it's somewhere they're supposed to be on a Saturday. Kids running between hay bales, while their parents stand around the cider stand, not in any hurry to leave, which is its own kind of strange, because Wendell spent most of his life assuming nobody in this county cared much where their food came from anymore. A reporter from the county paper drives out sometime in the 3rd week, notebook in hand, asking how exactly an old man turned a dumping disaster into what half the town is now calling, without much irony, the Pumpkin Festival. Wendell isn't much for talking to reporters, gives her short answers, mostly, until she asks what he thinks people are actually buying when they drive out here on a Saturday. He thinks about it a second longer than he thinks about most things. People tell you I sold pumpkins, he says. I don't know that's really what happened. Feels more like I sold folks a reason to be out here together. It's not a line he planned. It's just the truest thing he's got. And the reporter writes it down word for word, though Wendell won't see the article until it's already been sitting on his kitchen table for a week, clipped out by his daughter-in-law and stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a cow. What started as 3,000 problems dumped on his land in the dark, without so much as a knock on the door, has turned into the thing this whole county talks about now. And not for the reason anybody expected. Not the dumping, not the mess, not even really the money, though the money's helped more than he'll admit out loud. It's what got built out of it. Once he decided not to bury the problem and be done with it. There's a moment, late in the 4th week, that sticks with the few people who were there for it. A man drives up in a nice truck, out of county plates, and starts asking around about who's in charge of the pumpkin operation. Using words like that, operation, like it's a business he's thinking about buying into. Turns out he's from some outfit that wants to talk about scaling the whole thing up, franchising it out to other farms, putting a logo on it. Wendell hears him out on the porch for about 10 minutes, polite the whole time, nodding in the right places. Then he tells the man, plain as anything, that he appreciates the interest, but he's not looking to turn this into something with the logo on it. The man doesn't push it much further after that. Doesn't seem to know quite what to do with an answer like that. Not being used to hearing no from people his company usually deals with. Dale, who's standing nearby stacking hay bales for the weekend crowd, doesn't say anything until the truck's pulled out of the driveway. Then he just shakes his head and says, "Some folks can't tell the difference between a farm and a franchise," and goes back to stacking bales like it's the most obvious thing in the world. Winter shows up the way it always does around here. Slow at first, and then all at once. Frost thick on the fence posts some mornings. The maples stripped bare. That hayfield that spent all of October buried under orange back to plain turned dirt. Resting for spring the way it has every year of Wendell's life. Almost all of it anyway. Sitting on the porch steps one morning in early December, dusted with the season's first light snow, one pumpkin, the last of 3,000. How it survived every sale. Every pie order, every truckload that left this place, over 2 months. Wendell honestly couldn't tell you. It just never got picked. A little girl, one of the same families that started coming out most. Saturdays back in October, boots 2 sizes too big, mittens clipped to the sleeves of her coat, so she can't lose them. Spots it while her mother's up at the house, picking up the last jug of cider for the season, and she asks him the question that's apparently been sitting there, honest the whole time. "How come you didn't sell that one?" Wendell looks at it a good long while before he answers. Long enough that the girl starts to think maybe he didn't hear her. Then he picks it up off the step, sets it down on the porch rail, and cuts it clean open with the pocket knife he's carried in his coat since before this girl's mother was born. Inside, packed tight in pale strings of flesh, is more seed than you'd think one pumpkin could hold. He scoops out a double handful, rinses it under the pump at the corner of the porch, water so cold it makes his knuckles ache, and pours the whole dripping mess into the girl's cupped mittens. Money spent quick, he tells her. Seeds you plant? That's the difference. It isn't a fancy thing to say. He's not a fancy man, but standing there watching her carry that double handful of seeds up toward the house, like it's the most important thing she's ever been handed. It's about as close as Wendell's come all season to saying out loud what the whole thing was actually for. The pies got eaten weeks ago. The soup jars are long since empty and back on Carol's shelf. Whatever cash came out of that coffee can went where farm money always goes. Feed, fuel, a new water pump he'd been putting off since spring. But the seed's a different kind of money. It doesn't spend down to nothing. It sits in a jar on a windowsill all winter, and come April, it's still worth exactly what it was worth in December, maybe more. He never set out to make 3,000 pumpkins into some kind of parable. If you'd asked him that first cold morning, standing at the edge of the pile with his coffee going cold, he'd have told you plain he was just trying not to let good food go to waste. Same as he's done his whole life with everything else that's ever come through this farm. The money mattered. He won't pretend otherwise. It kept the lights on through a hard stretch. But somewhere along the way, without exactly planning it, he ended up teaching half this county the same lesson. His father taught him standing at the edge of a field that looked a lot like this one. Come spring, the trucks come back down that same stretch of road. Nobody's dumping anything this time. They're picking up orders. Pie pumpkins reserved weeks in advance. Seed packets, promised to gardeners who heard the story secondhand at church or at the feed store and wanted in on it themselves. They're dropping off volunteers for what's already being called, a little grandly for Wendell's taste, the farm's first annual harvest festival. They're bringing back families for a second season. Kids a little taller than they were last October, still telling the story of the year. The whole county went orange, where trucks once backed up in the dark before sunrise, and left a mess without so much as a word. Now, they show up in broad daylight, expected, welcome. part of something Wendell built without ever intending to build anything at all. Just an old man refusing to let good food rot in a field because somebody else couldn't be bothered to find a proper home for it. 3,000 pumpkins could have turned into 3,000 regrets. A cleanup job too big for one man. A summer lost to complaint and rot. And neighbors who never let him hear the end of it. Inside, packed tight in pale strings of flesh, is more seed than you'd think one pumpkin could hold. He scoops out a double handful, rinses it under the pump at the corner of the porch, water so cold it makes his knuckles ache, and pours the whole dripping mess into the girl's cupped mittens. Money spent quick, he tells her. Seeds you plant? That's the difference. It isn't a fancy thing to say. He's not a fancy man, but standing there watching her carry that double handful of seeds up toward the house, like it's the most important thing she's ever been handed. It's about as close as Wendell's come all season to saying out loud what the whole thing was actually for. The pies got eaten weeks ago. The soup jars are long since empty and back on Carol's shelf. Whatever cash came out of that coffee can went where farm money always goes. Feed, fuel, a new water pump he'd been putting off since spring. But the seed's a different kind of money. It doesn't spend down to nothing. It sits in a jar on a windowsill all winter, and come April, it's still worth exactly what it was worth in December, maybe more. He never set out to make 3,000 pumpkins into some kind of parable. If you'd asked him that first cold morning, standing at the edge of the pile with his coffee going cold, he'd have told you plain he was just trying not to let good food go to waste. Same as he's done his whole life with everything else that's ever come through this farm. The money mattered. He won't pretend otherwise. It kept the lights on through a hard stretch. But somewhere along the way, without exactly planning it, he ended up teaching half this county the same lesson. His father taught him standing at the edge of a field that looked a lot like this one. Come spring, the trucks come back down that same stretch of road. Nobody's dumping anything this time. They're picking up orders. Pie pumpkins reserved weeks in advance. Seed packets, promised to gardeners who heard the story secondhand at church or at the feed store and wanted in on it themselves. They're dropping off volunteers for what's already being called, a little grandly for Wendell's taste, the farm's first annual harvest festival. They're bringing back families for a second season. Kids a little taller than they were last October, still telling the story of the year. The whole county went orange, where trucks once backed up in the dark before sunrise, and left a mess without so much as a word. Now, they show up in broad daylight, expected, welcome. Part of something Wendell built without ever intending to build anything at all. Just an old man refusing to let good food rot in a field because somebody else couldn't be bothered to find a proper home for it. 3,000 pumpkins could have turned into 3,000 regrets. A cleanup job too big for one man. A summer lost to complaint and rot. And neighbors who never let him hear the end of it. Instead, it turned into pies sold 2 towns over. Wages a handful of teenagers earned doing honest work. A festival that didn't exist a year ago, and now has more people asking to volunteer than he's got jobs to give them. The pumpkins are long gone now. The way everything on a farm eventually goes eaten, sold, composted, or planted back into ground that'll grow something else come summer. What didn't go anywhere is the way this whole county looks at a pile of something nobody wants now, because Wendell McIntyre showed them mostly by accident what it looks like when somebody refuses to see 3,000 problems as anything other than 3,000 chances he hadn't gotten to yet. And somewhere up on that porch, in a jar on the windowsill, there's a handful of seeds waiting on April.